Hi everyone, my name is Rhiannon Bovin and I'm with the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation. Today I'd like to introduce to you Hill Goodspeed, the museum's historian. He's going to talk a little bit with us about the Doolittle raid and its impact on naval aviation. So Hill, come on.
Hello everybody, welcome to this latest Facebook Live History Up Close event. I'm Hill Goodspeed, been the historian here at the Naval Aviation Museum for a number of years, coming to you right off the Blue Angel atrium. If you hear some jet noise in the background as I'm talking, the Blue Angels are out flying today practicing, maintaining their skills as they prepare for a return to the air and air shows sometime this year, hopefully. But I know everybody in the United States and around the world undergoing a very difficult time. And I'm going to take you back in time to another difficult era in our nation's history. So flashback to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, and then subsequent offensive action against American forces all over the Pacific. And President Franklin D. Roosevelt was looking for some way to strike back at the Japanese. And what took place and the plan that came into being and its execution was one of the most audacious and heroic missions ever flown in the history of the U.S. military. And the Navy had a tremendous amount to do with it. The aircraft behind me is one that you wouldn't be accustomed to seeing in the Naval Aviation Museum. It's not painted like a typical Navy aircraft, and it certainly doesn't have Navy painted on the side of it. It is a B25 Mitchell bomber. This one actually is a B25J aircraft, but it's painted to replicate a B25B, which was the type of aircraft flown by the Doolittle raiders. And this particular aircraft was built in 1944 and arrived at the museum, and it underwent about 4,500 hours of restoration recently in time for the 75th anniversary of the Doolittle raid. And then just this past September was rolled in here to the museum right off the atrium. And to tell you why the B-25 had such a role in naval aviation, again, we go back to around the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the aftermath, looking for a way to strike back at Japan. And the story begins with a submarine officer of all people, Captain Francis Lowe, who was visiting Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia. And as he was walking around Norfolk, he noticed U.S. Navy carrier aircraft making landings on the airfield. And they were making landings in an area that was painted out to look like the outlines of a carrier deck. It was something that naval aviators do all the time then and to this day. It's called Field Carrier Landing Practice, or FCLP. And Lowe had the idea of, hey, why, if we're going to strike back, can we put some other aircraft on this type of space and launch them to attack? Because that was really the problem as far as the striking Japan, really the lack of land bases within range. So it was going to have to be a ship that took some aircraft there, but they needed to have an aircraft that could fly with enough range, or have enough range to launch at a significant distance away from the Japanese home islands, so there would not be an actual threat to the carriers. So Lowe went back to his boss. His name was Admiral Ernest King. He was the commander-in-chief of the United States fleet, really tough officer. President Franklin Roosevelt said King was so tough he used to shave with a blowtorch. But he was a very audacious, very strong-willed person. He definitely had an offensive mindset. And so King told Lowe to go talk to the air officer on the staff, a guy named Captain Donald Duncan. And if you've ever been to NAS Pensacola and you drive through the front gate and look to your immediate right, there's a statue of Donald Duncan, who later became a four-star admiral. And Duncan and Lowe started to talk about this plan. And then Duncan went to the Army Air Forces to see and discuss with what they could perhaps contribute to such a mission. And he started talking to a lieutenant colonel by the name of Jimmy Doolittle. And Jimmy Doolittle was one of the most famous aviators in the United States and pretty much the world at that time. He had established many speed records. He had a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He had done anything you could imagine in aviation up to that point. And Doolittle was fully on board and pretty much volunteered himself and arranged for himself to lead the mission. And the first thing they had to decide was what aircraft, what longer range aircraft than the single engine carrier planes like this F4F Wildcat or this Dauntless here that Donald's showing you, what could launch would then have a significant amount of range and the ability to carry a significant amount of ordnance to actually have an impact on bombing Japan. And the choices were limited because really what guided it was the ability of the aircraft to take off in a relatively short distance, and also the wingspan of the aircraft could not be too wide because there was only a certain amount of distance between the island of the carrier, which is the superstructure on the starboard or the right side of the carrier, and the edge of the flight deck. So they were very limited in what types of plane they could choose, and they chose the B-25. And as you see here, it's a twin-engine aircraft. It's a medium bomber. When the Doolittle Raiders launched in 1942, April 18th, 1942, it in fact was going to be the first combat mission for the B-25. It was not, it was a relatively new aircraft. And so this is the one they selected. Wingspan, a little over 67 feet. Top speed, about 320 some odd miles per hour. So they arranged to get some B-25s, and the next thing for Doolittle to do was to find the crews. And the crews were drawn from the 17th Bombardment Group because, as I said, the B-25 is a relatively new aircraft, so they had to draw, there was really a relatively small pool of individuals to draw upon. And so they were all volunteers, and eventually there would be 80 individuals who launched on the Doolittle raid. And they made their way down to Eglin Field, now Eglin Air Force Base, which is in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, which is just down the road here from Pensacola. But as I said, these aircraft were going to have to launch from an aircraft carrier. And by the way, they had proven that that could be done. Actually, they sent a couple of B-25s out on board the USS Hornet to practice a launch and see if it could be done. And they did that one day off Norfolk, Virginia. So once they proved that it could be done, it really proceeded forward. So the Doolittle Raider crews were sent to Eglin Field, but they needed somebody to train them on how to take off in a short distance. So what did they do? They turned to NAS Pensacola and the flight instructors that were here. And among the scores of flight instructors here, they chose one named Lieutenant Henry Miller. And he received orders and $6 per day of per diem, which is how much they paid back then in February 1942, to head over to Eglin Field for a mission he really didn't know much about. So he arrived over at Eglin, and eventually he figures out that he's going to be training the Doolittle Raiders, including Jimmy Doolittle himself. So if you want to put it in a modern perspective, that would be like, say, for example, LeBron James, acknowledged one of the best basketball players in the world. Imagine having you being somebody who knew something about playing basketball that LeBron James did not know how to do. Once he learned, he was probably going to do it very well, but you had that bit of knowledge. So that was pretty much like what Henry Miller was experiencing. Here he is. He had a bit of information that Jimmy Doolittle needed and his Raiders needed. So he started to train them. And a number of years ago, retired Admiral Miller came to the museum and donated some of his papers. And this is an example of some of the notes, handwritten notes that he took while he was training the Doolittle Raiders. And you'll see the top name on here is Jimmy Doolittle himself. And so this is one of the prized possessions here at the museum. And so he started to train them, teach them how to take off at short distances. One of the Raiders actually got to the point that he established the record, 287 feet he could take off, have one of these things airborne. Now, as they were preparing for the raid, they had to modify these planes a bit. The main thing was weight. So they reduced anything they possibly could weight-wise. So they took out what they didn't need. One of the interesting things about the raid, as far as what they did to save weight, was the defensive armament. There actually was an underside turret here that they removed. But one interesting feature, if you go around the tail, as we walk here, you're going to see these two black sticks. They look like machine guns from a distance. They are actually broomsticks painted black. And so that was really to throw off any Japanese fighters that may try to pursue the aircraft. Other modifications they made, they needed to pack the aircraft with fuel, so they decided to remove stuff they didn't think they would need. One of them was heavy radio equipment, about 230 pounds worth, and they had collapsible fuel cells that they added to the aircraft. And one interesting modification they made was in the bomb sight. At this time, there was a highly specialized, highly secret bomb site called the Norden bomb site. And the company slogan was, or the company media on the bomb site was, you could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from high altitude with the Norden bomb site. Now that wasn't necessarily true, but one thing about the Norden bomb site, it was highly effective, highly secret, but it was only effective at high altitudes. The Doolittle Raiders were going to bomb from relatively low altitude. So, for 20 cents, one of the Doolittle Raiders came up with a bomb site, and it was called the Mark Twain bomb site. And we have replicated it right here, as you will see in the turret, the Mark Twain bomb site. So gradually, the Doolittle Raiders learned to fly, launch from a short distance, and eventually made their way. And another thing I might mention before I do that, another modification they made were the propellers. They wanted to make sure they were as smooth as can be and were not pitted, so they had propellers that made for more efficient airspeed. They also modified the carburetors, the Bendix Corporation. They brought them in to modify the carburetors to make the aircraft as fuel efficient as possible, because they were going to be at the extent of their range. And so eventually they got to, the aircraft made their way to California, where they were loaded aboard USS Hornet, which is CV-8, one of the Navy's newest aircraft carriers. The commanding officer was a guy named Captain Mark Mitcher, who later on became the famous commander of Task Force 58 later in the war. And then they headed out to the Pacific. And en route, they were joined by USS Enterprise, another carrier, and some other escorting ships, because with Hornet, with these 16 B-25s on the flight deck, they were not going to be able to have any of their own carrier aircraft to help defend the task force. So the Enterprise was along so that she could launch her aircraft to fly combat air patrols in the event of enemy air attack. Another element of the museum's collection actually participated in the Doolittle raid. We have a blimp car here called the L8, which was a control car for a blimp, and the L8 actually flew off the coast of California and delivered supplies to the Doolittle, to USS Hornet, dropping them on the flight deck. And apologize for the jet noise again as it's coming through. Getting a little quieter now. So eventually they're making their way to Japan, and en route, along with them on the carrier is Henry Miller, the one who trained them. And there was another naval officer, a naval aviator, who had an impact on the raid. His name was Stephen Jerica. And Stephen Jerica was an intelligence officer, in addition to being an aviator. And before the war, he had been an assistant naval attaché in Japan. And he was a very keen observer of all that was going on in Tokyo. And while he was there, he made detailed notes of locations of factories and what have you. And he actually briefed the Doolittle Raiders on the targets that they were going to face. So everything was going well. And then the Japanese had positioned vessels, off the coast of Japan, looking to warn or to give notice of any enemy forces approaching. And as the raiders were approaching Japan, a couple of these boats were sighted, and the fear was that they had made reports to the Japanese government and the Japanese military, and that the cover for the mission had been blown. So the decision was made to launch the Doolittle Raiders at ranges that were farther away from the intended launch point, which was going to stress their fuel and make it virtually impossible for them to reach Chinese airfields, which is where they were supposed to land after they completed their runs. But as I said, these were 80 volunteers. They knew it was a very dangerous mission. Certainly they had fears as they got the signal on the carrier to Army pilots, man your planes, and they knew they were at a farther range. But that's what they had volunteered to do. So one thing also we have in the collection is a plan of the day from USS Hornet. This is April 18th, 1942. And you'll notice what's interesting about it is all the typical activities aboard a ship are going on, but one notice that it was going to be a very important day or unique day is on the back. And it says, from the Hornet to the Army, good luck, good hunting, and God bless you. And so on that morning, a little before 9 o'clock, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle led the way. He had about 467 feet to launch his aircraft. Along Hornet's flight deck was a white line painted, and the goal was for them to keep the left wheel of their left main landing gear of their B-25 on that white line as they launched. They benefited from the fact that carriers, even to this day, when they launch aircraft, they turn into the wind to create wind over the deck to help get aircraft airborne. There were about 30-foot seas at the time, so the launch officers had to time it perfectly, so when the ship was on its way down, they didn't want to launch them because that didn't help with the airspeed or help with getting off the deck. But when the ship rose, if they could time it as such, it would almost be like a little assistant, a ramp to help them get aloft. A lot of people didn't think or were skeptical that they could get off the deck. There was one sailor on a nearby ship that put $10 in a pot that was being circulated around the ship, saying that less than half would get off the flight deck. But all 16 made it off the deck and headed over the wide expanse of the Pacific to get to their targets in and around Tokyo. All of them managed to drop their bombs. They attacked again, as I said, at low level, and then became the big challenge, which was trying to get as far as they could into China, so that they could link up with friendly forces. And that they tried to nurse as much fuel as possible out of their aircraft, but unfortunately, because of the distance they had launched from, they were unable to really get to those airfields. And so the crews found themselves either bailing out or actually ditching along the coast of China. And in that process, 3 of the 80 raiders were killed in action, either drowning or one of them died as he was parachuting out of the aircraft. There were 8 who actually were captured by the Japanese, and of those 8, 3 were executed by the Japanese. The others survived till the end of the war. There was one crew that actually flew their aircraft and made it to Vladivostok, Russia, where the crew and the aircraft were interned by the Russians. The crew was eventually returned, the aircraft was not. There were reports that aircraft actually flew in Soviet service later on in the war and into the period after the war. So if there is a surviving Doolittle raid aircraft, that would be the most likely candidate of where it might be, but there's been no word of that existence of that aircraft. So as far as, let's look at the Doolittle raid as far as its success. Was it a big success as far as the damage inflicted on the Japanese compared to the later raids of what happened when U.S. bombers bombed Japan? It was not a great material success as far as the damage caused, but the psychological success could not be measured, and it had a psychological benefit on both sides of the Pacific. For the United States, it was when word of the raid came out, it was a tremendous boost to American morale. And for the Japanese, who tried to have their general public or civilian population believe that the home islands were immune from attack, it shattered that myth. And also advanced a plan that was currently in the final stages of sending a large carrier force to try to draw the last of the U.S. carriers in the Pacific Fleet out to battle, and that was the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. Now, a few items about this a few neat stories about the Doolittle raid in addition to the raid itself. One of them relates to this aircraft. When we rolled it out, we initially displayed it around the anniversary of the Doolittle raid, the 75th anniversary. And there are some Air Force instructors called us that when the aircraft rolled out, and they were members of squadrons that were assigned to the 17th Bomb Group back in 1941-42. And they wanted to come have a ceremony next to the aircraft because the squadrons from which the Doolittle raiders were drawn are still in existence. So that was a really neat thing. Another thing about the B-25, it still has a role in naval aviation. There's one called Panchito, which is a civilian-owned aircraft, and a couple of times a year, it is among the aircraft that go to the Naval Test Pilot School at Patuxent River, Maryland, where older aircraft are flown so that current Navy, Marine Corps, international test pilots can get a feel for what it was like to fly one of these types of aircraft, gives them an exposure to a different type of flying. And one of the final stories that relates to naval aviation and the Doolittle raid relates to where President Roosevelt said the raid came from. It came from, obviously, USS Hornet, as we have talked about, but he certainly did not want to let anyone know that it was a carrier that launched these raids. So he was asked, where did the raid come from? Where did it come from? And his response, he took a novel of the time. It was called Lost Horizons by James Hilton. And the novel had a fictional city in Asia called Shangrila. So he told the reporters, tongue-in-cheek, the raid came from Shangrila. Well, the Navy, wanting to commemorate that, had an aircraft carrier that was under construction. And it was an Essex-class aircraft carrier. And they decided to name the aircraft carrier Shangrila. And so this is a model of USS Shangrila, CV-38. It actually served during World War II, launched actual carrier strikes on Japan later in the war. It also served throughout the 1950s, 60s, operated off Vietnam. It was at the atomic bomb test at Bikini. And actually my grandfather was aboard during that time. So Shangrila has a connection to my naval aviation background and my family. And so this commemorated the Doolittle raid. Now Roosevelt also used the name Shangri-La for something else. He wanted to have a place where he could escape for a time the rigors of the White House. And so he had a camp established for himself up in the Maryland mountains near Washington, D.C., and he called it Shangri-La. And that camp had that name until President Eisenhower assumed the presidency, and he wanted to name it after his grandson, and today it's known as Camp David. So thank you very much for joining us today for this history up close on the B-25 and the Doolittle raid. Be happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right, and we actually do have a few questions today. Jim from Facebook asks, how long of a deck run did the first aircraft actually have?
It took off in 467 feet, was Doolittle's. He was right up at the front of the pack. So as each aircraft took off, they had a little bit of a longer deck run. But as I had mentioned earlier in training, Doolittle had successfully launched in less than 400 feet, and one of the other raiders is in less than 300 feet. So they had been well trained, but certainly launching from an airfield at Eglin Field, concrete runway, is much different from launching from a pitching carrier deck. So I'm sure there were a few nerves here and there.
Jim also asks, what was their gross takeoff weight and flyaway speed?
Well, the gross takeoff weight was roughly a little over 27,000 pounds, but they trained actually to launch at a weight of 31,000 pounds, because that was actually Doolittle's anticipated weight for the aircraft to launch.
So Mr. Richard Blake says, wasn't there a reunion of the Raiders at the museum maybe in 1982 or 92?
There were Doolittle Raiders reunions here. At least one was held here over the years, and Doolittle himself was at the one. Henry Miller was an honorary Doolittle Raider. He would go to the reunions periodically, and one of the Raiders during one of the visits here told me a very interesting story. He was one of the enlisted bombardiers or flight engineers, I can't remember, but he said his only 2 times he ever bailed out of an aircraft in his long career in the Army Air Forces and the U.S. Air Force. One was when he jumped out of the Doolittle raid B-25 on that mission. And the next, he was taking a U.S. Air Force plane to a reunion of the Doolittle Raiders and experienced malfunctioning or some problems, and he had to bail out of that one too.
Wow, that is interesting. So Felipe asks, is your aircraft on display a B-25B, or was it retrofitted to look like it was from the Doolittle raid?
It is a B-25J. Produced in 1944, so it is actually was restored. Took about 4,500 hours, as I think I referenced, by staff and volunteers here to make it look like Doolittle's B-25B from the time he launched on the raid.
So what qualities made a good pilot back then?
Well, it's the same sort of qualities that would make a good pilot or aviator in these days. You had to have the ability, certainly reflexes. It took a lot of, it's a lot different flying a B-25 than it is some of the modern aircraft. So you had to have pretty good reflexes. You had to have pretty good mental acuity. You also had to be, I think that one thing's true, that pilots of this day and age have told me, and ones I've interviewed in the past, is to be able to compartmentalize. When you're in an aircraft, you have to be able to manage multiple tasks, and also you have to be able to, if some situation arises, you have to be able to compartmentalize that situation, not let it get to you, and so you can follow the procedures you have in place to extricate yourself from the situation. And you just had to have I think certainly a spirit of adventure, because flying is an adventurous profession.
So we've got another question. Does your display aircraft have a sample of the 50-cent bomb sight that replaced the then secret Norden bomb sight system?
It does. The Mark Twain bomb sight we did replicate one of those, and it is in the nose of our B25 to tell that story about how the Doolittle Raiders adapted the aircraft to make them as ideal as possible for the mission they were going to fly.
So our good friends over at the Naval War College Museum ask, if Enterprise had not been part of the Doolittle raid, would she have participated in the Battle of the Coral Sea?
I think there was a definite chance that she would have. Admiral Nimitz, the Japanese were making a big strategic push to the South Pacific, and Admiral Nimitz really feared that push would really disrupt the lines of communication between Hawaii and U.S. Ability to get supplies down to Australia, interrupt those lines of communication. And there was a belief that the Japanese, in an effort like that, were going to commit a big share of their aircraft carriers. So Admiral Nimitz would have wanted to have as much of his carrier air power there as possible. And actually, when the Doolittle Raiders when the Doolittle mission was completed, Hornet and Enterprise returned to Hawaii, and Enterprise was quickly turned around, as was Hornet, and sent down to the South Pacific in hope of getting down there in time to bolster the forces there. Of course, they did not actually make it in time for the Battle of Coral Sea, which was the first engagement in history in which the ships did not come within sight of each other. All of the attacks were carried out by aircraft.
So Jeffrey, he says, would you expand a little bit on that the museum's B25 is not exactly like the Doolittle airplane, especially the glass tail gunner position on the museum's bird?
Well, the aircraft is, being a J, they had to convert it to the B. And so if you look on the rear, the aft part of the aircraft, there is no glass canopy as mentioned. It is simply, it's covered up, and it has the broomsticks coming out, and that was one of the examples of the modifications that the Doolittle Raiders made.
He also says, I understand Mr. Doolittle had to lighten the aircraft a bit to expand on range. Can you talk a little bit about that?
He did have to lighten the aircraft. Primarily was the radio equipment, 230 some odd pounds, and any other weight-saving measure they could take. And so that was, if they had to replace any of that weight, they did so with bombs. And what's interesting aspect about the mission was when Doolittle got back to the United States, he actually thought the mission was a failure. And he thought he would be court-martialed, when instead he was presented the Medal of Honor by President Roosevelt in the Oval Office, which he did not want to accept, but ended up being ordered to do so.
So did all 16 aircraft carry the same ordnance to Japan?
They did. They carried a 2,000-pound bomb load, was the designated bomb load for which consisted of 500-pounders. Now, some of these were also incendiary, designed when they hit to trigger fires, because Japan at that time, a lot of the structures were made of wood, and the hope was to actually trigger fires that would consume or cause much more damage.
How much fuel capacity did they have?
That is a good question. Based on the having to add fuel, that is one we'll have to respond to, because off the top of my head, I don't know.
And also, did they have auxiliary fuel tanks?
They actually put in auxiliary fuels, and they were collapsible tanks that they put in, and as the fuel diminished, they could actually collapse. So they did have auxiliary tanks that were added to the aircraft for the mission.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. What happened to the Hornet? Did it continue service after the Doolittle raid?
That's a good question. Hornet did continue service after the Doolittle raid. actually participated in the Battle of Midway, and it was the carrier that launched the famous squadron called Torpedo Squadron 8. The carrier-based element of that squadron had one survivor, George Gay. It also fought at the battle, fought off Guadalcanal, and it was actually sunk during combat operations off Guadalcanal. And recently, if you've been seeing in the news, Paul Allen's underwater research vessels are going out and finding the wrecks of U.S. ships, and one of the wrecks they recently found was that of USS Hornet.
There you have it, folks. Mr. Hill Goodspeed, thanks for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
And we'd like to welcome you again this Thursday. We're going to do this again, and we're going to be featuring the Grumman F-3F with Lieutenant General Twain. Thursday, April 9th at 11 a.m. Central Time. And that's a wrap.